When I stand before you and speak of the empath and the narcissist, I am not merely describing two individuals locked in a psychological dance. I am unveiling a drama that has lived in the unconscious of humanity for centuries. It is an archetypal drama written into the very fabric of our psychic inheritance. A story as old as the myths of gods and mortals. The empath is not simply a kind person, nor is the narcissist simply selfish. They are carriers of primordial forces, shadows of one another, mirrors through which the soul is compelled to look upon its own concealed face. The empath's life is often shaped by a deep attunement to the emotional undercurrents of others. From childhood, this sensitivity emerges not as a gift freely chosen, but as a survival strategy. The child who absorbs the moods of a wounded parent, who learns to regulate the storm of another's unspoken pain, becomes the one who carries burdens, not his own. This is the seed of the empath, a soul conditioned to live at the border where its own feelings dissolve into the feelings of others. Such a person grows to perceive the world not through clear boundaries, but through porous membranes, forever sensing what is unseen, forever touched by the suffering of those around them. And then enters the narcissist. To understand this figure, we must not reduce him to a villain in a moral tale. The narcissist is also an archetypal force, the embodiment of the wound of selfhood. He is the one who, unable to tolerate his own fragmentation, constructs a mask, a persona so rigid and glittering that the fragile inner child beneath it remains untouched and unseen. The narcissist lives in a perpetual flight from the abyss of his own inadequacy, seeking hosts upon which to project his shame, his pain, his unacknowledged despair. And who better to carry these unbearable fragments than the empath, who has always been prepared to carry what does not belong to them? So the bond forms, the empath and the narcissist, drawn together, not by chance, but by the gravitational pull of unconscious recognition. It is a union that is not truly a union, but a siphoning, a channel through which one bleeds into the other. The empath becomes the chalice, the narcissist, the unending thirst, and for years, sometimes for lifetimes, this cycle repeats: projection, absorption, depletion. But then comes a moment that is both an act of rebellion and of sacred awakening. The empath, worn down by years of carrying pain that was never theirs, begins to feel the tremors of a truth rising from the depths. It is a truth that whispers, "You are not infinite. You are not called to be the sacrifice for another's refusal to face their own soul. You were not born to be the scapegoat of someone else's shadow." What happens when the empath refuses to carry the narcissist's pain is nothing less than a cataclysm, both for the empath and for the narcissist. For the empath, it is the first taste of individuation, the emergence of the self from the prison of identification with the suffering of others. Individuation, as I have long taught, is the process by which the human being becomes whole, no longer a fragment of others' expectations, no longer a vessel for collective projections, but a unique manifestation of the divine psyche. For the empath, to refuse is to say, I return this burden to its rightful owner. I will no longer mistake compassion for bondage. I will no longer confuse love with self-annihilation. Yet, let us not be naive. This refusal is not simple. It is accompanied by guilt, by fear, by the shaking of the very foundations upon which the empath's identity was built. To stop carrying another's pain feels, at first, like betrayal. It feels like cruelty. For the empath has equated worthiness with usefulness, love with self-erasure. When they put down the burden, the voices of the unconscious rise in protest. If you do not carry them, who will? If you do not save them, will you not be abandoned? Will you not be unloved? This is the crucible of transformation. It is in this moment of unbearable guilt and fear that the empath encounters the archetype of the shadow. The shadow says, you have hidden your own needs, your own anger, your own boundaries beneath a mask of light. You have made yourself holy by denying your own humanity. But I am here, and I demand to be integrated. The empath, for the first time, must sit with the uncomfortable reality that their compassion has been a defense, their giving a way of avoiding their own darkness. And what of the narcissist when the empath finally refuses? Here too we must speak with honesty. The narcissist is confronted with the collapse of the illusion that others will forever be available to carry what he cannot face. When the empath withdraws, the narcissist is forced to glimpse his own abyss. He may rage, he may lash out, he may seek another vessel, but a seed is planted. The recognition, however fleeting, that the mirror has shattered, that the supply of borrowed wholeness is not infinite. Whether he chooses to heed that seed or bury it deeper in denial is his own journey. In myth, we see this pattern everywhere. Consider the figure of Atlas, condemned to carry the heavens upon his shoulders. The empath is Atlas, bending beneath the unbearable weight. But imagine if Atlas were to set down the heavens and say, these stars are not mine to bear. Chaos would erupt, yes, but from chaos emerges new order. The heavens would not fall into destruction. They would simply return to their rightful place. So too, when the empath refuses, the world does not end. Instead, a reordering takes place. The narcissist is left with his own sky to carry, and the empath discovers the ground of their own being. This is the alchemical moment, the transformation of victim into sovereign, of scapegoat into self. I tell you, the refusal of the empath is not an act of abandonment, it is an act of love. For it is only when one ceases to carry another's pain that one can truly meet the other as an equal, no longer from the posture of savior and saved, but from the sacred space of two whole beings. To carry another's pain endlessly is to keep them from ever facing themselves. To refuse is to offer them the terrible gift of truth in dreams. This drama often appears in symbols. I recall a patient who dreamt she was walking through a forest, carrying a child on her back. The child was heavy, its face obscured, and she stumbled under the weight. At last, she reached a clearing where a fire burned, and a voice told her, "Set the child down. It is not yours." When she did, the child dissolved into smoke, and she awoke weeping. This dream was not about rejecting love, but about releasing the phantom burden of another's unlived life. The child was the projection of her partner's wounds, which she had carried as her own. By setting it down, she began the journey back to herself. This is what happens in the psyche when the empath refuses. The projections dissolve, the false child vanishes. What remains is the fire of individuation, the flame of selfhood that had been buried beneath layers of obligation. The empath discovers that beneath the exhaustion, beneath the martyrdom, there is a soul longing not only to serve, but to live, and yet this fire is dangerous. It burns away illusions, and with them, it burns away identities. The empath, who has lived as caretaker for decades, may find themselves asking, who am I if not the one who heals? Who am I if not the one who absorbs? The answer is not immediate. It emerges slowly, painfully, through dreams, through synchronicities, through encounters with the symbols of the unconscious. One discovers the animus or anima within, the inner masculine or feminine that guides them toward integration. One confronts the self, the great archetype of wholeness, which whispers, "You are not defined by what you carry, but by what you are." This, my friends, is the essence of liberation, but liberation is not the end. It is the beginning of a greater responsibility to live from one's own center, to engage others not as savior or victim, but as co-pilgrims on the path toward wholeness. When we enter deeper into this mystery, we must understand that the empath's refusal is not merely a psychological shift, it is a spiritual initiation. For years, perhaps lifetimes, the empath has played the archetypal role of the wounded healer, sacrificing themselves in the hope that their suffering might redeem another. This archetype is not without nobility, but when it hardens into identity, it becomes a prison. The refusal to carry what is not yours is the breaking open of that prison. It is the moment when the chains of ancestral patterns fall, when the invisible contracts written in childhood tears are finally torn apart. The narcissist's pain, when carried by the empath, becomes a phantom weight that warps reality. The empath comes to see themselves not through their own eyes, but through the distorted lens of the narcissist projections. They begin to believe that their worth lies in endurance, that love must always come with the price of suffering. When they set it down, the world trembles, because an old illusion is breaking. The illusion is that one can ever heal another by erasing oneself. Let us not underestimate the terror that arises in this refusal. For the empath, this act can feel like stepping into death, the death of the old self, the one who was loved only for their capacity to endure, the death of the persona that was built upon selflessness, To say no more is to walk into the underworld, where all the rejected parts of the self wait, parts that were exiled long ago in order to survive. Here lives the anger the empath was never allowed to feel. Here lives the desire that was silenced. Here lives the self that was abandoned while attending to everyone else. To refuse the narcissist's pain is to descend into this dark realm, to meet the shadow. Face to face, the shadow will ask, why did you betray yourself? Why did you believe that love required your crucifixion? Why did you silence me when I was only trying to protect you? These are not accusations, but initiations. The shadow must be heard, must be integrated, for the empath's light is incomplete without the darkness that balances it. True compassion cannot exist without boundaries. True love cannot exist without the capacity to say no. And I recall a woman who came to me after years in a relationship with a man whose charm masked an unquenchable hunger. She said, I thought I was strong because I could endure anything. I thought my patience and forgiveness were proof of my love, but her body had begun to collapse under the weight. Illness crept into her bones. Her dreams filled with images of drowning, of carrying corpses on her back. When she finally gathered the courage to refuse, to walk away, she dreamt she was standing before a river, placing stone after stone into the water until a bridge appeared. On the far side was a child holding a candle. She woke weeping, for she realized the child was herself, waiting all these years for her return. This is the transformation. The empath does not become hard or cold when they refuse, they become whole. They reclaim the inner child who had been abandoned for the sake of others. They light a candle in the dark, not only for themselves, but for all who have suffered under the same pattern. For in refusing, they send a message into the collective unconscious. The cycle can be broken. The burden can be returned. The soul can be freed. And what of the narcissist in this moment? Do not imagine that he will accept it easily. The narcissist structure is fragile, like a mask of glass that must never crack. When the empath refuses to carry his pain, it feels to him like annihilation. Rage erupts, accusations spill forth, manipulations intensify. He may plead, he may threaten, he may twist reality to convince the empath that they are cruel, selfish, unloving. This is the narcissist's desperate attempt to preserve the illusion that his wounds can remain hidden. But when the empath does not yield, the mask begins to shatter. For the first time, he is confronted with the raw wound of his own emptiness. Here lies a great paradox. The empath's refusal is perhaps the only true chance for the narcissist's healing. As long as someone else carries his pain, he never needs to face it. But when the burden is returned, when the mirror no longer reflects only his grandeur, but his emptiness too, the possibility of transformation emerges. Not all will choose it. Many will run. Many will seek another empath to repeat the cycle. But the seed is planted nonetheless. In mythic language, this is the moment when Persephone refuses to remain in the underworld. when she claims her right to return to the surface. Others my rage, but her ascent is inevitable, and with it comes the turning of the seasons, the return of spring. So too the empaths, their refusal is the rising of life after a long winter. The narcissist may remain in shadow, but the empath walks toward the light. Yet the journey does not end with refusal. For the empath, what follows is a long and delicate process of rebuilding. To live without carrying another's pain is unfamiliar, even frightening. Silence may feel unbearable, because for so long their identity was defined by the constant noise of others' needs. Freedom may feel empty, because the chains had become familiar companions. It is here that dreams become the guide, the language of the unconscious, offering symbols to shape the new self. One man told me of a recurring dream after leaving such a bond. He dreamt of a house with many rooms, each filled with mirrors. At first, every mirror showed the face of his former partner, accusing and scornful, but as the dreams continued, the faces began to fade, replaced by his own reflection, first as a stranger, then as a friend. Finally, one night, he dreamt, he touched the mirror, and his reflection stepped out to embrace him. He woke with a sense of peace he had never known. This is the psyche's way of showing integration, the reunion of the self with itself. And so I tell you, when the empath refuses, the world does not collapse. It is reborn. The empath begins to experience love not as a burden, but as a reciprocity. They discover that compassion is not the same as self-sacrifice, that to give from fullness is not the same as to give from depletion. They learn that their intuition, once hijacked by the needs of others, can become a compass for their own destiny. But do not mistake this rebirth for the end of struggle. Each refusal must be renewed. Old patterns will whisper, shadows will lure, guilt will knock at the door. The narcissist within the part of the empath that still longs to be needed, that still fears abandonment, will tempt them to fall back into old roles. Yet each time they choose to remain sovereign, the self grows stronger, the wholeness more rooted. This is not merely personal, it is collective, for in every empath who refuses, the archetypal pattern of sacrifice without end is broken. The collective unconscious shifts, however subtly. The lineage of mothers who gave until they vanished, of fathers who bore the weight of silence, of children who carried the grief of entire families. This lineage is rewritten, a new myth is born. The myth of the one who sets the burden down and yet remains whole, who loves without losing themselves. And this, my friends, is perhaps the most profound gift the empath offers the world, not the endless carrying of others' pain, but the living testimony that boundaries are holy, that love without selfhood is not love at all, and that wholeness is the only ground from which true healing can arise. When the empath sets down the burden, the psyche does not simply breathe in relief, it begins to reconfigure itself around a center that had been forgotten. The center, which I call the self, is not the ego, nor is it the persona that we show to the world. It is the hidden wholeness that lies beneath all masks and all wounds. When the empath has been entangled with the narcissist, their life has revolved around the orbit of another's wound. Their psychic energy, their very life force, has been poured into keeping that wound hidden, carrying it as though it were their own. But when they refuse, this energy returns home, and with it comes both terror and revelation. For it is a terrible thing to stand face to face with oneself after years of self-abandonment. The empath may suddenly feel stripped bare, as though every role and identity they once held, caretaker, healer, martyr, has been burned away. This is why the refusal feels so radical. It is not only a refusal of the narcissist's pain, but also a refusal of the old self. The ego trembles, unsure of how to survive without the familiar script of sacrifice. But what trembles is not the soul, it is the mask. Dreams often reflect this initiation. Patients who reach this stage describe dreams of fire, of masks, melting, of standing naked in public squares. They are being shown that the false coverings must burn, that what is vulnerable must finally be revealed, and beneath that nakedness is a deeper strength. The recognition that one's value is not in what one carries, but in what one is. Yet, there is a paradox here. Many empaths, upon laying down the burden, discover a hidden rage, long repressed beneath the layers of compassion. Rage at the years stolen, at the manipulations endured, at the exhaustion that consumed their body and soul. This rage is not evil. It is the shadow demanding to be heard. For too long, the empath believed anger was incompatible with love, but anger is the guardian of the boundary. Anger says, you may not enter here. You may not take what is not yours. To integrate this anger is not to become destructive, but to reclaim the fire that had been smothered. In myth, we see echoes of this transformation. Think of Inanna, the goddess who descended into the underworld. She was stripped of her crown, her jewels, her garments, until she stood naked before the Queen of the Dead. The empath's refusal is such a descent. They are stripped of every illusion, every false adornment, until only the essential self remains. And like Inanna, they do not return unchanged. They rise with new authority, carrying the wisdom of the underworld within them. And what of the narcissist, once more left alone with his own abyss? The narcissist may seek another empath quickly, as though patching a hole in his fragile skin, but something lingers, a fracture in the mask, a memory that someone once refused, that someone once saw through the illusion. This is the beginning of potential redemption, though few will accept it. Most will flee from the mirror, yet every refusal by an empath plants a seed of truth that the narcissist's pain cannot be forever outsourced. that one day he must face his own reflection. Now, let us turn inward once more to the empath's rebirth. When the burden has been set down, when the rage has been acknowledged, something remarkable begins to stir. Joy, not the superficial joy of pleasing another, but the deep, primal joy of existing as oneself. It arrives tentatively at first moments of quiet peace, of laughter untainted by fear, of desire that belongs fully to the self. This joy is frightening in its unfamiliarity, for it does not depend on being needed. It arises simply from being. This is the gift of individuation. The empath who once lived as a reflection of others begins to inhabit their own body, their own soul. They discover that intuition, once hijacked by constant vigilance over others' moods, can now be turned inward, guiding them toward their own destiny. They realize that dreams once filled with drowning and burdens now reveal images of flight, of open fields, of light breaking through clouds. The psyche is reorganizing itself around the self, no longer around the other's wound. But the path is not without obstacles. Guilt remains a persistent shadow. The empath, conditioned for years to equate love with self-sacrifice, may feel pangs of betrayal each time they honor their own needs. The narcissist's voice echoes within them still, whispering that they are selfish, unkind, unworthy if they do not carry, and so the refusal must be practiced again and again, like a sacred mantra. I am not your burden. I am not your scapegoat. I am not the vessel for your shadow. Each repetition strengthens the soul, carving new pathways into the unconscious. I once worked with a man who, after decades of living as the emotional caretaker for his entire family, finally began to set down the roles. In dreams, he saw himself climbing a mountain, carrying bags filled with stones. At the summit, he opened the bags and poured the stones into the wind. But as he did, voices cried out from the valley below, "You cannot leave us. We will fall without you." He trembled with guilt, but the dream showed him a hawk soaring overhead, whispering, "You are not their ground. You are their wind." When he awoke, he realized that by carrying them, he had kept them from walking their own path. His refusal was not abandonment, it was liberation. This is the deeper truth. When the empath refuses, they do not only free themselves, they free the narcissist, even if the narcissist does not recognize it. For only in the absence of a scapegoat can the narcissist be forced to confront his own soul, and only in the absence of chains can the empath discover their own. We must not forget the collective dimension. Empaths who refuse are rewriting ancestral myths. They are saying no to centuries of sacrifice demanded of the gentle, of the sensitive, of those who were told their only worth was to bear the unspoken pain of others. They are saying yes to a new myth, the myth of wholeness, where love and boundaries walk hand in hand. where compassion is not martyrdom, but the radiance of a soul that knows itself. Symbols of this new myth arise in dreams across the world. People describe visions of broken chains, of cages dissolving, of rivers flowing freely once dams are lifted. The unconscious is speaking, showing that what was once bound is being released, and in each individual's refusal, the collective unconscious moves closer to healing. Thus I say, what happens when the empath finally refuses to carry the narcissist's pain is nothing less than the turning of an age. It is the end of one myth and the birth of another. It is the cracking of the old story in which love meant suffering, and the dawning of a new story in which love means truth. The empath who refuses becomes not cold, but luminous. They become a living reminder that the soul cannot be owned, that each being must carry their own darkness to find their own light. They walk as witnesses of a deeper law, that wholeness is not achieved by erasing oneself, but by embracing oneself entirely. The final stage of this journey is the realization that the refusal is not an end, but a beginning. It is not simply the closing of one relationship, nor even the dismantling of an archetypal pattern, but the opening of a door into the unknown. The empath, who has lived as a vessel for another's wound, steps, for perhaps the first time, into the wilderness of their own soul. This wilderness is vast, filled with shadows and light, and it requires courage to walk it without the familiar crutch of self-sacrifice. But it is in this wilderness that the self begins to speak most clearly. In the quiet that follows refusal, the empath hears whispers that were long silenced. The whisper of the body, once ignored in exhaustion, now revealing its rhythms, its joys, its pain. The whisper of desire, long exiled as selfishness, now emerging as the call of life itself. The whisper of creativity, stifled under the weight of responsibility, now bursting forth in dreams, in art, in visions. These whispers are not distractions. They are the soul reclaiming its language. It is important to say that this rebirth is not linear. There are regressions, relapses, returns to old patterns. The narcissist may reappear cloaked in apology or rage, testing the empath's newfound boundaries. Other figures may emerge, carrying echoes of the same archetype, inviting the empath to repeat the cycle. Each encounter is another initiation, another chance to affirm, I will not carry what is not mine. I will not betray myself for the illusion of love, and each affirmation deepens the roots of wholeness. When the empath finally refuses, dreams begin to show new images, no longer drowning, no longer burdened, no longer walking under a dark sky. They dream of gardens, of bridges, of doors opening. These symbols are not mere fantasies, but the psyche's way of guiding the conscious mind toward a new life. The unconscious, once colonized by the narcissist's shadow, now begins to replenish itself with its own symbols, its own mysteries. In the language of alchemy, we could say that this is the moment of the rubedo, the reddening, the stage when the alchemist emerges from the chaos of dissolution and discovers the gold within. The empath who once lived as lead-heavy, burdened, carrying what was not theirs, transforms into gold, radiant, sovereign, uncorrupted by projection. This is not achieved by denying compassion, but by purifying it, by freeing it from the contamination of martyrdom. The narcissist too is touched by this transformation, though often indirectly. When the empath refuses, he is left staring into the abyss of his own being. Many will flee from this abyss, seeking another vessel, another empath to bear the weight. But some may finally begin to see that the abyss is their own shadow, waiting to be acknowledged. Whether they choose transformation or repetition is not the empath's responsibility. The empath's task is not to save, but to live, and here lies the greatest paradox of all. The empath who refuses does not become less loving, but more, for when love is no longer entangled with bondage, it becomes something pure, something luminous. It is no longer the desperate attempt to heal another at the cost of the self, but the radiant overflow of a soul at peace with itself. This love does not chain, it liberates. It does not consume, it creates. It does not erase, it reveals. I tell you this, the world needs such love. The world does not need more martyrs consumed by other shadows. The world does not need more silent sufferers bearing what was never theirs. The world needs whole beings, empaths who have walked through the fire of refusal and emerged sovereign, for only then can compassion become a force of transformation rather than repetition. Only then can relationships be born not from need, but from truth. This truth is ancient. It echoes in every myth, where the hero must refuse the false burden, where the goddess must reclaim her throne, where the wanderer must return from the underworld, carrying not another's wounds, but the treasure of their own soul. It is the truth that individuation requires separation, that wholeness requires the courage to walk alone before one can walk together. So I say again, what happens when the empath finally refuses to carry the narcissist's pain is nothing less than the birth of a new world. For the empath, it is the world of the self, radiant and whole. For the narcissist, it is the world of confrontation, where denial can no longer shield them forever. For the collective, it is the world of a new myth, where love is no longer defined by sacrifice, but by truth. And in this new myth, the empath becomes not a victim, not a martyr, but a pioneer. They show that it is possible to walk away from chains, to set down burdens, to say no without losing love, to say yes to the soul without abandoning compassion. They become living symbols of the fact that wholeness is possible, that the cycle can be broken, that love can exist without bondage. Perhaps you ask, what is required to walk this path? It is simple, though not easy. It requires listening to the whispers of the unconscious, honoring the symbols of dreams, embracing the shadow rather than denying it, and trusting that the self, the great archetype of wholeness, will guide the way. It requires the courage to be misunderstood, to be called selfish, to be accused of cruelty, and yet to remain faithful to the truth that carrying another's pain forever is no love at all. And so I leave you with this vision. Imagine a figure standing at the crossroads. Behind them lies a road of endless burden, of carrying shadows that are not their own, of exhaustion and self-betrayal. Before them lies a road into the unknown, dark, mysterious, but alive with possibility. At first, the figure hesitates, for the old road, though painful, is familiar. But then, from deep within, a voice rises. It is the voice of the self, the voice that has been silenced for too long. It says, "This is your life, this is your soul, walk your path." And the figure turns and takes the first step into the unknown. That step is a refusal. That step is the beginning of individuation. That step is the moment when the empath becomes whole. What happens when the empath finally refuses to carry the narcissist's pain? A chain is broken, a mask is shattered, a myth is rewritten, a soul is reborn, and from that rebirth comes a love the world has almost forgotten, a love that does not bind but liberates, a love that does not consume but creates, a love that arises not from the fear of abandonment but from the wholeness of the soul itself. This is the love that heals. This is the love that transforms. This is the love that the empath at last becomes when they refuse